Page 8. The state of objective circumstances in the Middle East, within the framework of East-West problems, but that perception is buttressed by the image of Israel as Western, politically similar to and friendly to America. And that image is strengthened by the familiar and integrated social presence of the American Jews. But beyond that, the integrated social presence of the Jews in America, providing its own kind of access to other groups, has created the basis for coalitions of effort. Thus, it has been naturally easy to gather allies in the non-Jewish community on Jewish issues, such as antisemitism, neo-Nazism, Soviet Jewry, or support for Israel. However, there has been another significance to community coalition and coalition politics for the Jews. That significance is reflected in the distinction customarily made between faction and coalition in politics. In faction politics at its most extreme, an interest group pursues its own interest only, forms its own party, runs its own candidates, does not consider compromise or negotiation. In coalition politics, negotiation and compromise among interest groups is primary. The purpose is to find a common agenda. Coalition politics has seemed a necessity for an orderly United States because of its heterogeneity. Early in its career, the American polity learned that stronger coalition politics seemed preferable not only in the matter of issues, but in the matter of selecting public officials. In the presidential campaign of 1824, none of the 5 candidates received anything near a majority from the Electoral College. The nominating process itself, developed by the 1840s, was the National Party Convention. The parties became coalitions for purposes of both elections and issues. Various factions struggled within each party, and factional leaders within each party, even when they gained a certain dominance, usually understood that it was necessary to pursue the party coalition process in order to win elections across the country. Between 1940 and 1980, the only campaigns in which one candidate received less than 40% of the popular vote were in 1964 and 1972, when bitter factional debates took place in the Republican and Democratic Party respectively, and clearly factional candidates were nominated. The Jews can reasonably feel threatened by a climate of factional politics, in which deadly political extremism is bred. And in somewhat narrower terms, the Jews can multiply their own effectiveness only by coalitional methods, increasing their access, helping to make it clear that their interests are the interests of a broader community, and multiplying their political power. It is a matter of history that since the 1930s, when the Jews became a cogent political force, the Democratic Party has been the national party. Page 9. In which the Jews have found and built their coalitional strength, because of compatibility of issue and temperament, with some other Democratic Party factions, as well as because Jews were largely situated in centers of Democratic Party power. And some Jews have always been engaged in Republican Party politics with some coalition effects, especially on local and regional levels, even though the main coalitional leverage of the Jews has been within the Democratic Party. So this active participation within the general community and coalitional effort has been the dynamic core of Jewish political effectiveness. But the circumstances within which this political effectiveness has taken place may be changing drastically. One change may be taking place within the Jewish community itself, a tendency towards some withdrawal from the integrative and coalitional process. That phenomenon will be dealt with below. But there are apparent changes within the political process itself which, including some electoral reform, allegedly threaten that basic dynamic of effectiveness. The decline of the parties. The changes which draw most attention revolve around the weakening of the political parties. However, the American political party has never been the kind of tight mechanism which political parties represent in much of Europe and in Israel. Among the founding fathers, there was a monumental distaste for political parties. Jefferson once said that if he could not go to heaven except with a political party, he would prefer not to go there at all. But there was always early attraction to coalitional politics, entailing the negotiation of differences among different constituencies. That attraction plus sheer political necessity created the networks which constitute the major American political parties. James McGregor Burns, who wrote of these networks as 4 parties, 2 congressional parties, Republican and Democratic, and 2 presidential parties, described each congressional party in these terms. It is not a tight, cohesive group of men, conspiring together in a secret chamber and pushing buttons on a nationwide machine. It is a loose cluster of men, sharing a common concept of the public interest, benefiting from and in turn protecting a set of rules and institutions that bolster their power. These men deal with one another by bargaining and accommodation, rather than by direction and command. The presidential parties are, of course, broader and more disciplined, but exist as a power only when a party's candidate is elected. The presidential networks are often different than the congressional networks, but also often intersect. Page 10. Indeed, if there is too little intersection between the two networks, a president and his party's congressional delegation, then it becomes more difficult for the president and the government to function. Sometimes, of course, there are inter-party coalitions, as in the frequent case of Republican conservatives and Democratic Dixiecrats. But, by and large, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party each maintains its own identity, both because of certain prevalent ideological tendencies, and simply because individuals need the network in order to function effectively and protect their power. These networks built their corporate strength on two foundations: patronage and control over the nomination of candidates. Both of those foundations have been crumbling as a result of electoral reform. Most recently, a party's ability to control nominations has been reduced by the growth of direct primary elections and by reforms requiring proportional representation at nominating conventions. In short, an increase in direct democracy has eroded corporate party strength. But, in reality, the weakening of the formal corporate entities known as parties will not mean the collapse of the political system in which the Jews flourish and exert influence, as long as the informal network arrangements known as parties continue in strength. The parties have been most important for Jewish political effectiveness because they have provided networks of access to policymakers and their circles. Jews, like others, have gained access to those networks not by connecting to a national party or even a state party, but by connecting to the basically autonomous apparatus of a local candidate or office holder, or directly to the apparatus of a presidential candidate. However, the apparatus or support system for any given political candidate does not just consist of influential and active individuals. It also includes symbolic representatives of the various constituencies, which may be important to the candidate. Some constituent groups, such as trade associations, send money directly to the campaigns, and that presumably is important if they want their candidate elected, but access is limited if it consists only of checks in the mail, and not of individuals who remain consistently close to the apparatus of the candidate and public official. In the case of groups like Jews, a more inchoate class than dairy farmers or automobile dealers, with a more complex agenda, the role of involved individuals is even more crucial. Jewish community organizations do not generally support partisan candidates, partly for tax reasons, but mainly for policy reasons. Most of these organizations will want some access no matter which candidate wins. The connection is mainly through involved individuals, who are also connected to those organizations. Page 11. Even the pro-Israel PACs have their main impact by introducing or backing up otherwise involved individuals. These Jewish organizations do help to organize explicit issue coalitions which then, through symbolic individuals, become an apparent part of a support system and agenda of a candidate or public official. This whole plexus of relationships, from the bottom up rather than the top down, describes political parties in America better than the image of tight national or state structures, and describes the far-flung way in which the Jewish community makes its connections. The deterioration of the parties refers to some further weakening of national, state, and regional party entities and functions, as against the autonomy of local offices. If this deterioration proceeds to the point where the two-party networks fail to function, or if factional politics begin to operate seriously outside these networks, rather than within them, the Jewish political fortunes will surely suffer in America. And if Jewish access to these networks is seriously cut off by radical electoral reform, which eliminates the importance of private campaign contributions, or insists on strict proportional representation at nominating points, then Jewish political fortunes will surely suffer. But the fact is that the two major party networks continue to function as networks, despite all the shifting permutations, because they still serve a basic purpose in the mutual protection of power, and even in the mutual expression of certain prevailing political values. All other things being equal, as long as those networks continue to function, the hyperactivism of the Jews will leave Jewish political effectiveness relatively unimpaired by current political reform and changes. The Democratic Party and the Jews. However, there is much discussion about one specific change in the nature of these party networks, which might affect the nature of Jewish political effectiveness. The fact is that the main Jewish connection throughout the past half-century has been with the Democratic Party network. And the issue coalitions with which the Jews have been explicitly engaged, i.e. blacks, labor unions, liberal Christian clergy, have largely been associated with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party network has been relatively sympathetic with the Jewish political agenda over the years. Furthermore, the Democratic Party congressional network, with which the Jews have been primarily associated, has dominated the political scene, having been the major political party in the House over 90% of the time since World War II, and in the Senate over 75% of the time. Page 12. If the Democratic Party loses its dominance because of some realignment which may be taking place, or if the Democratic Party network becomes less sympathetic to the basic Jewish agenda, partly because of shifting issue coalitions, and if the Jews fail to find the same strength of connections in the Republican Party network, there are obvious negative implications for Jewish political influence in the future. The 1984 voting suggests that the Jews are not leaving the Democratic Party. Table 1 demonstrates that, according to the best estimates, including the redistribution of third-party votes, according to probable major party options, the Jews return to a normal Democratic distance of about 25 points between their presidential voting and that of the general population. The Jewish Democratic distance in congressional voting has usually been even higher than in their presidential voting. And in recent years, about 6 out of 10 American Jews have continued to indicate that their party affiliation is Democratic, 1 out of 10, Republican, and about 3 out of 10, Independent. Depending on the survey, there may be seen some growth of independent affiliation at the expense of the Democratic Party, but the Republican ratio has not changed significantly. The question at the moment is not whether the Jews are leaving the Democratic Party, but whether the Democratic Party network is leaving the Jews and their agenda. As Table 1 suggests, Jewish voting has been affected by the same political impulses as other Americans in voting for presidential candidates. But within those trends, there has been a special dimension of loyalty to the Democratic Party. The political profile of the American Jew, statistically speaking, has something to do with that continuous loyalty. Jews continue to score disproportionately high among the white population on matters of economic liberalism. That is, government intervention on behalf of the poor and disadvantaged. For example, the 1984 National Survey of American Jews found typically that Jews supported the goals and philosophy of such government programs, as welfare and food stamps by a 75-17 ratio, government aid for abortions for poor women by an 81-13 ratio, and affirmative action without quotas by a 70-20 ratio. The Democratic Party is seen by the national population as the network which singly stands for such values. There are indications that American Jewry has followed the rest of the population in becoming more fiscally conservative. In one 1981 regional survey, where 4 out of 5 Jews called for more government spending for health care, half of them said that it is proper to cut social spending, and 2 out of 3 supported a statutory limitation on government spending. Page 13. But, while fiscal attitudes may have shifted within the Jewish population, party loyalty has not, at least by the light of the 1984 election. There is another factor of liberalism, which apparently has more saliency for the Jews. That is the factor of cultural liberalism, which might be more aptly called cultural tolerance, tolerance for differences. For the Jews, these are, of course, issues of deep self-interest. Civil liberties comprise one category of such issues, but they are not really in contention in America today. Anti-Semitism itself is another such category. And, while American Jews never relaxed their foreboding about the possibility of anti-Semitism, it was not an issue that made an important difference in the selection of candidates in the election year. An analysis was made of the reasons why 814 randomly selected Jewish voters in Northern California made their presidential choice, Table 2. Asked to pick the 1 or 2 issues out of 8, which would make the most difference to them in their selection, only about 4% chose anti-Semitism, among both Mondale and Reagan voters. The domestic issue which most concerned Mondale supporters, in twice the proportion of Reagan supporters, was keeping church and state separate. This result was replicated in other surveys around the country. In the course of heated public discussion about religion and the state, the prominence of fundamentalists like the Reverend Jerry Falwell and a publicized negative trend in court decisions, church-state separation became, among Jews, a code phrase for cultural tolerance. This issue, as it is embedded in the larger matter of cultural liberalism, is related also to the Democratic Party milieu, in which Jews have grown up politically. Jews may have become more affluent, but they still do not belong to the same social network as the middle and upper-class white Protestants, who form the backbone of the Republican Party. The church-state issue was not just another constitutional issue, but the signal of a cultural climate important for the Jews, and it seemed clear that the Democratic Party still provided that climate better than the Republican Party. However, while Mondale was an assurance on that score, there was still some foreboding expressed that the Democratic Party could leave the Jews in the future. On the matter of Israel, the Jews seemed to make little distinction between the two parties. Table 2. But even a majority of the Mondale voters expressed the opinion that Jesse Jackson had too much influence on the Democratic Party. While they were concerned about anti-Semitism on his part, they were more concerned about his positions on Israel. There is a foreign policy faction represented by Jesse Jackson, featuring non-interventionist or page 14. Third world foreign policy sentiments which could prove deleterious or even openly hostile to Israel's interests if it became dominant. The dominance could change the image of the Democratic Party as the home of cultural liberalism for the Jews, hardcore opposition to Israel being translated as a form of intolerance for American Jews. Such a reversal of foreign policy by the Democratic Party is not likely. However, contention on this issue could disrupt Jewish relationships with other elements of the Democratic Party, especially at local levels. The main political association which seemed to suffer as a result of the 1984 election was that of the black community, which voted almost 9-1 in favor of Mondale. It is true that the Jewish population voted almost 2-1 in favor of Mondale, but there are a couple of significant differences. Although the blacks represent about 8% of the voters, about twice that of the Jews, they are as disproportionately low in their political activism as the Jews are disproportionately high. They have not been in a position to be as activist in terms of campaign contributions, nor in terms of other electoral involvement. And, despite the Jewish vote at the polls, there was a renaissance of organized Jewish activism among the third of the Jews who did opt for Ronald Reagan. The Republican Party generally recognized the importance of that activism as distinct from voting and is not likely to turn its back on the Jewish community because of the voting numbers. Also, the primary black agenda consists of stands on economic issues, which are largely incompatible with those of the Republican Party. The primary Jewish agenda is not so incompatible with the Republican Party agenda. For example, support for Israel, support for Soviet Jews, except apparently in certain church-state matters, about which there is division within the Republican Party. As a result, an increasingly dominant Republican Party on the American scene would seem to leave the black community in a greater state of political disrepair than it would the Jews. Labor leadership would also be in trouble, of course, although union members in the country came close to splitting on presidential choice, 54% for Mondale in the ABC exit poll. Some Hispanic leadership was found on the Republican side, and 44% of the Hispanic voters followed suit. But there is no evidence to support the belief that the Republican Party is about to become nationally dominant, although there may be some realignment in certain southern and southwestern regions. The presidential voters, in the Los Angeles Times national exit poll, indicated that they had split their congressional votes between Democrat and Republican candidates, 46-47, and the results were in accord. Also, there has already emerged sharp contention within national Republican leadership. Page 15, which suggests that their life after Reagan will not be as easy as the 1984 figures suggested. However, for the black community, there is also the question of how the contentions within the Democratic Party will be resolved. And there is the question of how the black leadership itself will approach that political future. If, for example, the more dissident elements of the Jesse Jackson camp were to become dominant, complete with a third world foreign affairs approach, Democratic Party politics would become more contentious, and the Jewish community would be caught uncomfortably in that contention. But Jesse Jackson was a spokesman for the black community on the domestic agenda, not on the foreign policy agenda which he espoused. It would seem to be indicated for Jewish activists in the Democratic Party, in supporting the basic black domestic agenda, to keep it separated from Jesse Jackson's foreign policy agenda. Under those conditions, the Jewish-Black alliance in the Democratic Party circles could remain undisrupted. The Jewish community and a narrowing effect. The Jewish community refers generally to all those Jews who are Jewish life, connected to or influenced by the network of organized elements in there, has developed a kind of politics intoxication among American Jews, which tends to oversimplify the political process. In doing so, they tend to overlook the fact that the Jewish community is itself a political force, and that politics is more than electoral or lobbying activity. Politics is all that activity which has to do with the making and administration of public policy. Jewish political activity is all that activity on public affairs, in which Jews engage in some organized and purposeful concert. When they are so engaged, American Jews comprise a political association. De Tocqueville described a political association in this manner: the public assent which a number of individuals give to certain doctrines, and the engagement which they contract to promote in a certain manner the spread of those doctrines. The Jewish community is a political association at those points, where there is an organized consensus on certain issues of specified interest to the Jewish community, and where there is an organized Jewish community network to promote that consensus. Most cogently, the Jewish community has established itself as a political association in matters of self-defense, i.e., American support of Israel, support for beleaguered Jews abroad, international human rights generally, civil rights in its full scope, civil liberties, freedom of religion, church-state separation, protection for Jewish institutions. Page 16. The first function of that political association is to discover and shape consensual strategies on the doctrines, to which there is natural assent in the bulk of the Jewish community. The second function is to promote the spread of those doctrines and strategies. The political association represented by the Jews and other ethnic religious groups differs significantly from that represented by the Automobile Dealers Association and other such business interest groups. Associations such as the automobile dealers tend to be equated with one or several specific organizations with relatively universal membership. The Jewish Political Association, a more complex social group with a more complex agenda, consists of a loose network of many organizations and connected individuals. There is at least one other significant working difference. The objectives of the Jewish Political Association come closer to matters of redressing citizenship wrongs and addressing citizenship aspirations, as touched on directly by the Constitution, than do the profit-making objectives of a business interest group. It is largely for that reason that most of the activities of the Jewish Political Association are not as constrained by legal regulations as are those of a business interest group, although some of the specific lobbying and electoral activities which spin out of this Jewish Political Association are so regulated, especially when they relate to Israel. But the point is that most of the combined elements of the organized Jewish community, as they address common public affairs of Jewish concern, constitute a political association and are engaged in political activity. This Jewish Political Association is so defined because it is in a state of some deliberate organization directed towards common political objectives. The Jewish community is not a political association just because it has some statistically prevalent opinions on certain issues, such as those related to social welfare in general. There are some political subjects outside the area of self-defense or of organized consensus on which there is a disproportionate weight of Jewish opinion. Jews are, for example, prevalently economic or social welfare liberals, as has been indicated above. However, in this display of opinions on social welfare, Jews represent a disproportionate supportive audience, rather than a political association. As a Jewish population, they are not primarily or consensually organized to promote doctrines and strategy on this subject, as they are on the subject of support for Israel or anti-Semitism, for example. It is true that some of the mechanism created by the Jewish Political Association in America adds to their working agenda objectives which,